started on exercise 216. The primary purpose today is we're going to actually put our first sun sky system into V-Ray, which makes the glass rendering a little bit better. It's not quite the full best strategy for it, but we'll get to the best strategy next class, but we have to kind of build up to it. So I have a skyscraper. This one has some chunks out of the sides. It has a slight twist to it. And I have the floors established, and I have the outer skin, or the skin established. I don't have the elevator core in this one, but it doesn't really matter because we're just rendering the outside of it anyway. But because I'm going to end up using this as a block, I want to spend a little bit of time and organize it before I start the recording. So I have a main layer called Skyscraper, and then below that I have sublayers for ceilings, floors, and I made one for an outer skin and an inner skin. And we're going to talk about this in just a second, about why you need both an outer skin and an inner skin. The existing skin I've put on the inner skin layer. Okay? From last time you may have had an infinite plane. If you had one, go ahead and delete it. If you have a light, go ahead and delete it. If you're having trouble selecting the light, you can type SEL light, and that should be able to select it. I don't have any selected here. I've also moved my object so that it's relative to the origin. And in my case, I have a cut out of one side of the building. And since I have that cut out of one side of the building, I left a line that goes to point 0, for reference for myself. Okay, and just helps with placement. I could have one on this side as well. It just gives me where the bottom of the building would be if it was the full of 100 feet. Okay, so now you may have noticed when you tried to render last time, if I have a surface and I have all of these floors coming right out to it and touching it, it's very likely that I'm going to get banding or some weird artifacts when I render. And that's a problem with V-Ray and how it deals with collisions of surfaces. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly enlarge the skin to make an inner and an outer skin. And this is an approximation, but it's for the rendering. It's not for the final quality output. Okay? And so if we were actually modeling a skyscraper and we took more time and we modeled, what the curtain wall actually looked like, this would be different, but we're doing an approximation of it, so I'm going to go ahead and use this method. So right now, I have a base of 100 by 200. I want to scale the building slightly larger than that. So first thing I'll do is I'll select the skin, and I'm going to go ahead and type copy, and then I'm going to choose in place to make a direct copy of the skin in exactly the same place. So I'll click in place. So now I have two copies. And we'll go ahead and change the one that I just made to be on the outer skin layer instead of the inner skin. And I can actually turn off the inner skin, and I can turn off the floors so I have just the object left. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly scale this to be a little bit larger. And so I'm going to scale it from the center of my building, which is right there. If I have trouble picking where the center is, I can go ahead and draw a diagonal line, which is going to allow me to pick the center. So what I'll do is I'll select my surface, and I'm going to type scale 1D, because this will give me a little bit more control, because I'm only going to scale in one direction. And I'm going to scale from the center of the base to one of the sides. And right now that should be 50 feet. Because the building was 100 feet. So I'll do like 50 feet, 6 inches or something as a value. And it'll make it slightly larger. Then I'll repeat the scale 1D. And I'm going to do it from the center right out to this side. Now, if you have a really complex building, this might not work perfectly. You might have to do it slightly differently. I'm looking at yours, right? In which case, we'll make an approximation. Maybe we'll render it without the floors in the first place. That might be the easier way of doing it. So in this direction, it would be 100 feet, 2 inches. And now, if I turn this on to ghosted for just a second, and I were to turn on my inner skin and my outer skin, if we zoomed in on the edge, you can see that the two skins are very close together, but they're not right on top of each other. Right? And so that'll help in this rendering process. Right? We can also see that the two skins happen to coincide on the top. which case I get this weird artifact. So if I wanted to address the top, I do the same thing. I select the outer skin here, and I scale 1D, and I go up this side here, which was, what was it? It was 600 feet, so I do 600 feet and maybe 6 inches because it's a little bit taller. And then I eliminate the thing. And if we zoom in Ghosted, you can see that it's now a little bit taller. Right? If you have something that's massively twisted, it may not work as well. But for a reasonable building, it's reasonable to do it. If you're having trouble ultimately and you're not getting the quality you want, or you're getting artifacting and you can't do this method, just go ahead and turn off the ceilings and the floors when you do the render. Right? Because, again, we're doing more about the background reflection than anything else. So I have an inner skin and an outer skin. I'm going to go ahead and leave my ceiling and my floors on. And yes, we can see a little bit of artifacting, but when I go ahead and render, those are going to go away because of that little bit of a gap. Okay, so I have that set up. I have my lines as a guide. And I'll go ahead and click on File, Save. And then I'm going to go to the course website and go to today's exercise 216. And at the bottom of 216, there's a download sfdowntown.3dm for part 2. What this is it's a really big 3D model of the city of San Francisco. Not something that I did or made. It was something that some grad students at UC Berkeley made a while back, so it's not accurate to today. It's a little bit old, probably 10 years old, but the point is it's usable. Okay? I have put in here a blue building site that matches the footprint of your building. So you'll be able to place your building directly into that little footprint, and it'll line up nicely. I'm making your life easy for you. Right? Also, if we look at layers, I have a layer called SF Model, and I also have a layer called Building Footprint. Building Site, sorry. Yeah. If it doesn't, there's a little bit of space around this, and you can use the space around it. There is a street that goes this way and a street that goes this way. If you have to, you could use that width this, right? If you don't like this location and you want to change and put it somewhere else, it's fine. You're just going to be responsible for finding the views to render. Right? The other thing that I've set up for you is I've set up some views. So if I go to Set View, I have Perspective 1 and Perspective 2, which jump us down to a street level perspective where we're going to see the building here at the end of the street corridor. And if I go to Set View, Perspective 2, same thing. It's a street level perspective looking at the building. Okay? And so I set those up on purpose so that we'd have some couple nice, easy views for you to do the renderings today. Okay? So let's start preparing this site for my rendering. So the first thing that I'm going to do is bring my building in the first place. Actually, I'll take a step back. You'll notice when you download this site that it's a pretty complex piece of geometry, and it makes Rhino run a little slow. Not horribly slow, but a little slow, and it can be a little cranky when you're trying to move things around and get a good view, for example. So what we're going to do is we're going to use something that's built into V-Ray. Go back to Set View, Perspective. I want to look up. Apparently my mouse is acting up too. Okay, so what this is, this object here, it's currently a mesh object, and it's actually several mesh objects put together. So if I were to try to select them, right, I'd be picking different groups of buildings and stuff. That's how it was built. It's not how I would have built it, but we've got different groups. It's just kind of messy. V-Ray offers us something that's called a V-Ray proxy object. And what a V-Ray proxy object is it's taking the geometry of a scene, something like this that's complicated, and it's permanently making it into a V-Ray recognizable file that is approximated in your original Rhino file. But when you go to render, it brings in all the geometry. So it's a way of simplifying while you're working on it in Rhino, but at the same time, it's a permanent operation. It's something that you do that completely alters the piece. So I don't always recommend it, but when we get to something like this model, it starts to slow down Rhino so much that it makes a good opportunity to do this. So we're going to go ahead and do it as an example. The key thing here is that it's a non-editable object after you create it. So if you want to put materials on it, you have to do it before you create the V-Ray proxy object. So like I said, it's a permanent change, and you have to have thought through a lot of things before. So I need to go ahead and assign a material to this object first. So I'm going to go ahead and select all the objects that are on the SF model layer. It makes life easier to select it that way than to go through and select all the individual pieces. I'm making sure that I definitely did not select the building site, because I want that to stay in place so that I can come back and get to it. Okay? So then I'm going to go ahead and go to my materials. And I was nice and also loaded the white porcelain for you. But if I hadn't already loaded it, you would click on Load Material and go to your flash drive under your V-Ray, and it would be under Porcelain, White Porcelain. You can choose to load any material you want, but I think the White Porcelain works pretty well as kind of an abstract, here's the cityscape, not trying to render it photorealistic, but then to showcase your building itself. Okay? So let me go ahead. I shouldn't have actually put that in. And so it's kind of a shiny white. It's something I really like as a material. Right? Those of you that have seen me do it before, you know I like that as a material. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the material. I could apply it to the layer, but I'm going to go ahead and apply it to the selection so that it's tied directly to the mesh. And then we're going to go ahead and create a V-Ray proxy object out of it. All right. So in our V-Ray toolbar, if it's loaded, right, there'll be this kind of tree-looking object, and there'll be, for a left click, a standard click of the mouse, it's to import a proxy object, and a right click is to write the proxy object, to create it. So we're going to go ahead and click on, right click on this button to create the proxy object. And it's going to say viz write VR mesh, right, if you want to remember that. And we're going to go ahead and name this and save it onto our flash drive. So we want to be careful of where it's going to go. So let me go ahead and go to today's exercise 216. And I'm going to call this SF downtown -VR mesh so that I know it's a V-Ray mesh. And I'll go ahead and click on Save. Then I get this little dialog box that pops up that says export all selected object as a single mesh file. That's what we want, right? But I can also, it's going to automatically, right? But right down here, set triangle count for preview mesh. Okay? So the default is set at 100. Right? When I leave it at 100, I'm going to get a very, very approximate version of what this looks like. And I'll show you at 100 what it does. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And I don't know why it keeps making my stuff disappear. And we're going to go into the land of not responding for a little bit. So keep our fingers crossed for a while. I'll come have a look. Hold on. Doesn't help if I stop recording. Okay. So like I said, it approximates the cityscape into a bunch of triangles. And so this is definitely in the neighborhood of an approximation. Stop. Sorry. Let me change mice because the one that's over here is horrible. Okay. So it approximates the city as a bunch of triangles. But like I said, the triangles aren't too accurate in terms of where what the buildings look like. We could increase that mesh count, the number of triangles. The problem is the more triangles you have, the harder it is on Rhino. So the purpose of making it a VR mesh was to simplify it down. Now I still have right here my building site, and I made sure that that was still available to me, not part of the original V-Ray mesh, so that I know where to place the building. Somehow when I did this, my layer was on the building site layer. I'm going to change this back to be on the SF model layer so that I can turn it off altogether. Okay? So I still have my building site right here. Let me go ahead and zoom selected on the poly surface here. Right? And now I'm going to go ahead and bring in my tower as a block. So I'll go to File, Blocks, or excuse me, Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. And I'm going to browse for my skyscraper. There it is. I'll go ahead and click on Open, and I'll say OK. Now, right here, I have the option to embed or embed and link. Make sure you always choose embed and link, which is important because the embed and link keeps a link to the original file. So if you make a change, it will say you made a change, and it'll reload that changed file, okay, or allow you to update the block. If it's just embedded, you won't be able to go back and update it based on the file without having to reload it. So I'll go ahead and check on embed and link, and I'll say OK. And it'll come in. And so it's coming in at 0.00. The site is not quite orthogonal, so I'm going to go ahead and need to rotate this. So I dropped it right on that corner, and I'll type rotate. I'll go to transform rotate, and I'm going to rotate along this corner so that it ends up in line with my building site. Okay? So it comes in as the skyscraper layer. Blocks are a little bit confusing because the block exists both on the layer that you bring it in on and also on the layers that it comes in with. It's kind of a weird counterintuitive thing. But I can confirm that just so that you can see it. Let me create a new layer, make that my active layer. If I turn off the building site layer, which was with the active layer, it'll turn off the block. But if I turn off the skyscraper, it'll also turn off the skyscraper. So it's this weird thing. So I like to put the block itself back onto its own layer. So I'll put it onto the skyscraper layer. So I'll change object layer so that it's entirely controlled by the skyscraper layer, right? Not by the building site layer, which is separate. OK. So now I have my building, which has my materials already applied. I have my site. And I have my V-Ray proxy object, which I can turn on. Okay, so there it is. So now you notice that I already set up my views before we made the proxy object. So that if I were trying to set up this view right now, it would be really easy to get behind a building and not actually see it until I went and rendered. So by setting it up before, when I could see the whole site, it makes life a little bit easier. You could also, if you get to this point, you could bring back in the Rhino model of San Francisco so that you could see it temporarily and then turn it off when you weren't using it. It's nice to have it not be so choking down the system. Looks like, based on that view, that I don't really like the positioning of my building. I think I'm going to rotate it all the way around. So let me go to rotate again. And then let me go back to my perspective 0, 1. OK, there it goes. I just wanted to be able to see that kind of side kink, right? And if we check my set view, perspective 0, 2, yeah, that's pretty good too. OK, so I have those two set. All right, doesn't really matter what view I'm in for right now. All right, now it's a matter of starting to establish the rest of the scene, the lighting and that sort of thing as part of the scene. So two things we're going to do. First thing is we're going to establish a sun, right, an actual sun, and then we're going to establish a sky system that ties to the sun. So the two are going to be related to one another. So the first thing that I need to do is up here on the V-Ray toolbar, there's an option for sun, right? It'll say sun with a little light. What a sun is it's basically a directional light that has a precise direction associated with where you are geographically, but it's also really, really powerful light. Right? The sun is extraordinarily powerful in terms of how much light it produces. That's why we have day and night. And to do that and to mimic it in V-Ray, we need to have a very, very strong light, which is why it's different than just your basic directional light. So when I click on the sun icon here, it's going to bring up the dialog box for the sun angle calculator. And it's set by default on manual control. I don't know exactly where we are, so I'm going to uncheck manual control, and I'm going to specify that we're in San Francisco. So I'm going to type under Find Place San Francisco, and I'll select it so that it's blue. Right? Then I'm going to scroll back up here, and I get a year. So it's 2015, what part of the year it is, and then I can also get a time. And I generally like to pick sometime in the morning, right, or sometime in the late afternoon. And that's because I get longer, more dramatic shadows when I do the rendering. It's really up to you, but those seem to be good times. So at this time of year, somewhere 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there in the morning works, right? We could check the box for daylight savings time because technically it's daylight savings time right now. It's up to you whether you check it or not. Basically, I play primarily with the sliders to control this. We can also change the month of the year. So right now we're in October, but if we wanted to be in the spring, we can change. Notice that as we get from December and January, the daylight hours are short. If we get into the summer, the daylight hours are longer, right? So you have some flexibility in terms of what you pick. You can also click on the Now button, which will adjust it to today's date and the exact time. It's a little late in the afternoon for me, so I'm going to pull it back to be a little after 9 in the morning. Okay? When I make those adjustments, it tells us what the sun position is, right? So it tells us on a compass, and it also tells us what the altitude of the sun is, how far above the horizon it is. Okay? So like I said, if we were on manual control, we could specify that value right here, right? But again, it's not something I know, so I'm going to use the guides down here to go ahead and put that in place. Once I'm done, I'll say OK, and it's going to ask me to insert the sun. So you see how it says position. A lot of people forget to actually put the sun physically in the model. Generally, I put it at 0, 0, 0. It's a good place to go. Or I could drop it in right next to the building. The point is that I want to put it somewhere where it's kind of obvious where it is. I'll put it right on the corner of the building, and we can then see that there's the sun. It looks exactly like the directional light that we've been creating, right? But it's going to act as the sun for us in this particular scene. Okay, so now the sun's in place. The next thing that I need to do is I need to establish the sky, so the V-Ray sky system. By the way, if you got lost during that, if we go to Tutorials, V-Ray, 8.17, 8.18 are the sun and the sky, and then we're going to go to 8.19, which is the physical camera. So all three of those are what we're covering today. All right, so I'm going to jump back to my Rhino model right here, and I'm going to go to my V-Ray options now, and this is where I'm going to establish the sky. So you've been to the environment drawer before, right? And a lot of times we switch this to white. Right? Well, instead of switching this to white or black or blue, we're going to actually click on the M that's next to the reflection and refraction background. And when we click on that, we're going to go to this drop-down menu, which currently says None, and we're going to pick, instead of Bitmap, which we picked before, we're going to come all the way down here and pick Text Sky. Right? And you'll see that we get some options. Default sky options. The sun currently says None. We want it to be the sun we just placed. And the sun we just placed is represented by this long string of numbers. Okay, you don't have to know what the numbers are. You just look for the long string of numbers. When you click that, it's going to tie the sky to that particular sun. Right? And so if we were looking outside right now at this time of day, the sky goes from kind of a lightish blue to a darker blue as we look up. Right? If the daytime was different, let's say it was later at night, right, more of the sky is going to be a deeper blue than the horizon. Right? The horizon will be a little bit darker, and then the bulk of the sky will be a little bit darker. Right? So depending on the time of day, that color is going to change. That's what we're doing. We're tying what the sky looks like to the time of day. Okay? So the rest of the options here are fine, so we'll go ahead and say OK. And now we have a sky that's tied to the overall scene. Okay? I have already specified the general skylight options, which are set at a particular color, 204, 229, 255, which is kind of a lightish blue. which gives us some background color. So that's already set for you. That'll be good. And that's it from the environment standpoint. Okay, so now I have a sun and I have a sky. If I were to go straight in and render, right, the scene is going to be way too bright. And so what V-Ray does is it mimics what it would be like to photograph the scene with an actual camera. And so if we were going out and photographing outside and doing the render, we would expose the camera correctly, and you guys can go back and remember what we talked about in 135 if you took it, about digital photography and what all these settings mean. But V-Ray has built into it what's called a camera. So I'm going to click on the camera drawer, and I'm going to check the box here for physical camera on. Okay, so that has to be checked. And the bulk of the settings are not enabled and I don't touch. The only thing I really touch is what's called shutter speed. And that's how long the exposure is actually going for. Okay, so somewhere between 200 and 300 is always a good place to start. Right? If your scene is too bright, you increase this number. If your scene is too dark, you decrease this number. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set this at maybe 200 for now. All right, and so I have the physical camera on, and I have my environment set. So I'm ready to start my rendering. I'm going to go to Output, and I'm going to pick a very small size. So right now I have a width of 320 by a height of 240, because I want to see if the settings look okay without consuming too many resources. So I'm going to go back to my set view, and I'll go to my perspective 1, and I'll go ahead and click on Render. So it's an itty-bitty tiny view, but no reason not to do a small view until we can kind of see what it looks like. Okay, so as I look at this little piece, and this is extraordinarily hard for you guys to see. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Right? I'm getting some sunlight coming through. I'm getting some reflections on my skyscraper. You see that there's a little bit of blue. Well, you probably can't see it. There's a little bit of blue that's starting to reflect in the sky. Okay, so we're looking reasonably well in terms of what this is going to look like. So I'm ready to push this a little bit further. So I'll go ahead and close this preview, this small render. And I'm going to go back to my V-Ray options. Okay? And so because we're at the point in the semester where we're going to start, one, producing larger renderings in size, but also we're going to start having environments and background imagery and more complex geometry, it's time to start using the network render. And so I've been working for a long time, probably 2.5 years, to get this network render set up so that it works. We've had some false starts. It's working really nicely now. And so you should, right, recognize in the beginning of the semester I told you about this little window that pops up, right, that's called the XML DRS spawner. If it's not showing, you can choose to turn it on by going to Start, All Programs. It's under Chaos Group and Distributed Rendering, and you can launch the Distributed Rendering spawner, right, if it's not showing. You don't have to have it running on your computer, right? But the more computers that have it running, the more access we all have to it. So what's going to happen is when I go to my system drawer, I'm going to check this box for distributed rendering on. And when I check that box, it's saying go out and look for any other computers that are in the DVC domain here that have V-Ray running on them and let me commandeer some of the resources from that computer, and so I can take my render and distribute it out to 50 computers, and each of them will do a part of it and give me the file back. Right? So it's a lot faster than letting just your computer run. Okay? So I'm going to turn that on, but I have to do a little bit more. Right here it says hosts, and there's a button with 3 dots on it. I'll click on that, and it may or may not have a bunch of preloaded computers in it. Depends on when the last time somebody ran a rendering was. So what I'll do is I'll click on Find Servers, and this can take a little bit of time. By the way, before we get too much into this, it's always a good idea to save your work, right, just in case, which I didn't do, so I may crash all of this. And it's going to say, found 69 unused DR spawners on the network. Right? That's a good sign. Right? Yeah, I'll take all 69 of those. Go ahead and say yes. And you'll see that it'll add a bunch more to our list. I want to go ahead and check these, which is a little annoying, so that it knows to use them. I know it's a little annoying. All right, that's probably enough for now. I can come back and get more. And then I'm going to click on the button for Resolve Servers, right, which is going to get the actual IP addresses for all the servers and get them ready. And then I'll go ahead and say OK. And this is where you cross your fingers that it doesn't crash, because sometimes it does at that point. Right? But it didn't, so we're in good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and close this now. Actually, I'm going to go back to my output. Right? And instead of having my little tiny output, we're going to bump up the size. So I'll click on the largest button here, the 2048 by 1536. But I want the height to be much taller. So I'm actually going to flip these around. So let's go maybe at 1500 in width, and let's do a height of maybe 3000. Right? And that's so that I can have a taller, skinnier rendering. Right? And I get a little bit more out of my view. So we'll try that and see. Maybe 1,000 by 3,000, something like that. All right, so now that I have the output set, I'm going to go ahead and click on the render button. And again, we hope it won't crash on me. Right? We see that my view has changed so that it's much taller. Right? We're getting a good old not responding, so be patient. Right? But we can also see that V-Ray is going out and looking for a bunch of hosts to parse out this rendering for me. Okay? So we're going to wait for a little while. It's worth the wait, even though it looks like it's going to crash, because once you get all of them and they start rendering, it's going to render significantly faster. Right? So we'll give it some time so that it can think. So it started, and I can actually look here at the V-Ray process, right? And it missed some of the hosts along the way because they might have been busy rendering somebody else. And it's going to start at this rendering, and I'm going to get a certain number of boxes. But as I go forward, right, this number of boxes is going to increase as I hit more and more of the servers, right? And at some point, it's just going to completely fill this with a bunch of little boxes, right? And so we're going to go ahead and let that render. It's going to take a little while. Right? Rendering is not something that is an instantaneous thing. Right? So a rendering this large with this complexity without the distributed rendering farm would probably be a couple hours. Right? But this will probably do maybe 30 minutes or so. So I'm not going to sit here and make you watch it the whole time. I'm going to encourage you to start working on it. And I'll pause and come back when it's done, and I'll show you the final result. Okay? So I want to point out one more thing about the network render, just so you can see it. When it's zoomed out far like this, you just see the boxes. But if I zoom in on the boxes, we can see all the individual computers and what labs they're coming from. Right? So this one's in 124, and it's computer 20. This one's in this room, and it's my computer. This one's in this room, and it's number 7 in this row. So you can kind of see how they're all working at the same thing right now. But when they're zoomed out, you don't see it as much. So if you're just working on, say, Rhino, it'll use resources in the background up to what there's thresholds that are set by the render spawner in terms of it shouldn't slow down your computer too much. You can, if everybody was completely silent in the lab and I started one of these, you can hear the fans kick on in the computers that are using it. The bulk of what it's using are not CPU cycles, it's using the graphics card to do the renders. So a lot of it's pulling off of the graphics card, where Rhino does more modeling out of the CPU. So it tries to balance, is the idea. Yes, definitely. So when we're doing a network render, if let's say we harnessed a bunch of the older computers that are still floating around somewhere and we use those in the network render, they might only give us 1 square or 2 squares. And the newer computers with more RAM and a better graphics card, they might give us 8 threads or 16 threads. So little squares. So it varies based on what computer you're borrowing from. So it's obviously been sitting up here for a while finished, but I wanted to at least point out that it is finished. And the advantage here is that it's a pretty high resolution, so as we zoom in, you can get pretty decent results. You can see, because I left the floors on, that I can see through the silhouette a little bit of the floor. But I also get good reflection of the background and the sky. The sky fades just like it would be if we looked outside. Right? On a crystal clear day, it fades from kind of a light white, whitish blue all the way up to a darker blue. The taller we get, as we get taller, it gets a little bit darker. That's the idea. The background was designed to be this kind of porcelain color. It's not super bright white because we're down inside the street. Right? In reality, I would probably crop this so that we had my building sort of out there. We didn't have all the rest of the space down below, but that's for something to Photoshop. So I just wanted to point out that it finishes. It's at a decently high resolution. We'll get into the final rendering and how high and how large this will be. Generally speaking, with printing, you want it to be 300 pixels per inch. You multiply the size of your final drawing times in inches times 300, and that's how you know how big the rendering has to be clear. Okay. For right now, we're all doing it about 1,000 by 3,000. Okay. So that would work fine for about a 10-inch tall print. Okay. So it will print fine on 8 by 11 feet. And we'll cover that more as we get further along. I just wanted to point that out. Okay. That's it.